My name is Nick Golfis, sculptor, artist from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Perfect. So Nick, can you tell us about your training and background?
Yeah, so I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and as I grew older, I was always sort of building things and sculpting things since I can remember. But my formal training was at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. It's a small town down in northeast Iowa. There I studied classical studies and sculpture, focusing mainly on clay, bronze, and plaster for the most part, a little bit of wax. And then towards the end I did some painting as well. From there I came back up to the Twin Cities and studied under a foam carver by the name of Jim Muirhead at a production company called V Corp for a couple of years when I realized I could make a living as a foam sculptor. Mainly large format, large scale designs. And then for the last 15 or so years I've been working at the Guthrie Theater prop department, honing my skills not only in sculpture and different alternative casting methods, but also woodworking and metalworking and just about everything.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So can you tell us how you approach this project of taking images of Russell's work and creating replicas for our studio here?
Yeah, well, at first it was quite daunting with the variety and the scope of the project was quite large, and so the first thing I did was sort of just get to know who Charles Russell was better and get to know the time that he lived in, get to know the environment he lived in, to sort of give myself a little bit of a primer as to how and where he would have been making his work. So I did that by studying a lot of historical photographs and reading up on his story about how he came from Missouri to Montana to become a cowboy, and how sort of the harsh winters sort of influenced his work and sort of got his start. And then from there, really sort of his career turned up. And so I sort of looked at that for any glimpses I could get, but the difficult part was most of the images I could find of him working were of his paintings. He's more well known as a painter than a sculptor, and so I had to do what I could from looking in the context and looking at some of the images that you guys provided, and then from there you sort of rely on some of my own sculpting methods to see what, first what sort of materials he would have available to him at the time, and then determine what the best way and process would be for me to replicate it. And so for each project I had to sort of look at it all individually, as I went along.
Now it's kind of interesting that you say that there aren't many images of him painting, because I think there's only one or two of him sculpted that you can ever see.
Oh, did I say that? I meant the other way around. Yeah. So all the images I found of his were of him painting, and I could find almost none of him sculpting. Right.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, exactly. And now that you say that, it's like, it's interesting because he was a sculptor, sort of first and foremost.
Really?
Well, as a kid.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and everything, and it was just sort of a habit that he took with him all around, and so for it. Well, I guess, painting is more of an elevated fine art, and it's easier to, show that aspect in a sort of a marketing way.
Sure.
And so it's just kind of interesting, right, that there isn't really much. It's only a few. So.
Yeah, and just in this sort of, and before coming here for this visit, I found some more images because I was just curious about it for my presentation, and I found one that he had more of his sculpture behind him, and then he actually had a painting that looked like a backdrop, and then would use that and then arrange the figures sort of in front of that backdrop. So like a diorama. And it's funny because one of the fine art projects I did, one of the last large sort of grouping of objects I did was all diorama based artwork. So my sort of background is in very detailed, very miniature objects. So I was sort of fortunate to work on this one.
So what were your thoughts? I know you say you didn't really know much about Charlie Russell, but I don't know, what did you think about him as you sort of continued to work on this project or learn more about him and the process?
Yeah, right. Well, he has a unique style, and that's sort of what stuck out for me was how his work, at first glance, has this sort of rough nature to it, but when you really get into it and start looking at the work closer and sort of dive into it, there's a naturalism and lifelikeness to it, even though it's in this sort of rougher. You can see some of his fingerprints and his gestures in the work. You still see like a really great balance of that sort of naturalism, and I found that was the thing that I was really trying to achieve with my work, was just trying to create that sort of spark that his work had that looked like it was almost alive, but in a sort of I wouldn't say crude way, but in a rougher style. Like you could do it and it looked like it was effortless. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things that I really had to take away from him.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, he's certainly very different than an academic sort of artist who comes at his bronzes. And I'm going to be happy when you get to see the show, a big show that we have, because we have a lot of casts that are lifetime casts. Mm-hmm. And it's hard when people look at a lot of Russell work that has been cast posthumously, because it looks very, very crude, and people don't think he's that great of a sculptor, but when you compare it with the stuff that actually he worked on, you can see it's like, it has that lifelike quality to it. It's not crude in that way that people think that he was sort of that sculptor.
No, I equate it to more like how John Singer Sargent was a painter, where you captured the essence and captured the naturalism, but with like 2 or 3 strokes. You could do that, and that's something that people look at. It's like, well, I could do that. But no, you can't do that. It's quite difficult to achieve that and have that realism at the same time.
Pages.
Right, and that was kind of the same thing with some of the smaller clay objects as well. Like sometimes you would make those as gifts for other people. That was sort of the initial sort of impetus for them, where some of it looks like, oh yeah, the horses obviously were something that I think he used in his process. It almost looked like he would use those as sort of models.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are sculptures that Russell did specifically for casting. Sculptures he mainly used for help with his painting, creating casting shadow and light.
Yeah.
And then sculptures that he was giving away as gifts and presents.
Yeah.
And so it's different when people look at things like plaster casts that weren't meant for bronze, but then people cast posthumously. And,
oh, sure. Right.
It wasn't meant for that. The majority of Russell's output of sculptures were not meant to be cast at all. And so it's kind of cool to see that his mixed media work for that in and of itself as a sculpture, rather than just thinking it needs to be in bronze or it was meant for bronze, because the majority of them were not.
Sure. And when we first started talking about this project and what you guys were looking for in it, it was my understanding that we wanted to create objects that looked as though he had just walked away from making them. And so for every piece, I not only had to figure out what I needed to build it and what materials and process I would need for it, but how I'd have to look at an object and see, okay, how much of this is aging from being made 100 years ago versus the way it would have been made and looked weathered at the time. And so I was always trying to find that balance of like giving it some character, giving it some age, but also giving it that sense of being freshly produced. And that was a trick, especially with some of these more involved sculpts. So we just talk about the process on this one?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so for the stagecoach, there were a number of elements that I first sort of broke it down to. It looked to me like a type of cardstock or cardboard, like a hard cardboard, was going to be the construction for the outside. And then I could tell the wood sides on it sort of helped give it form and help give it shape. And so for the outside, I used a mat board that I knew it could take paint and not warp and get sort of misshapen. And then for the wood, I ended up going with a poplar because I know you get nice clean cuts without any knots or anything like that in it. And then for the construction, I used some archival glue and then nails. And so it was sort of determining, okay, what's the scale of the nail I need to use? And so like almost every piece and every project I did for this, while sort of prototyping it, I would usually get 2 to 3 different types of materials for each element of it, so I could test, I could sort of get some different feel for it. And so we have a thicker cardstock that goes along the outside, and then this other material that goes around the bottom, and the top needed to have a little bit more of a curve to it, so that was a thinner material. That it was the stuff I hadn't used before. It was called butterboard, but it was almost like a waxed cardboard. And then for the supports that go down to this panel on the side, it appears as though he did a knot style that almost replicates like a chain. And so that was a specific knot tie that I had to do. I actually had some help with on the knot tying parts of it. And then for the top, it looked like a fiber board of some kind, where it had this sort of texturing going on the top and a bit of a weathering. And so for that, I ended up having to create my own because I couldn't find something like this in today's world. And so I actually laminated some fiber onto a piece of cardboard and then gave it the paint treatment to sort of bring out some of that roughness to it. And then some of the parts of it are actually made to come apart. And so if you want to, you can actually flex this middle piece and remove that, so then I could paint and do all the things into it while working on it. And so that was something I had to consider with each of his pieces, was not only how do I construct it, but how can I construct it in a way to get all the detail I wanted to while I'm making it, because I usually like to make it and complete the piece and then paint it. But in some cases like this, I'd have to paint pieces along the way and then insert them after.
Wow, that's interesting. It makes me learn a little bit more about Russell's process, that he would have, as you mentioned, these removable parts that then you could go inside or create more little details if you put people inside or something. I'm just thinking how he was intending to finish it. And, when you're looking at his work now, does anything jump out at you, or anything now that you see the piece in person other than just a photo?
Yeah, just a few things. Like some of the parts where the wood that he used was a little bit more of a rough cut material. Didn't necessarily translate in the images, and so my work appears a little bit smoother. Other things that you can pick out, just looking in the inside, that I couldn't see from some of them, of just little supports, or how this piece here would then slot into this piece to give it an additional structure, was something that I couldn't see. And then something I was trying to figure out the whole time while working on it is because you can see this has this sort of spray up of dirt kind of thing, like it's been riding it along. It's important to sort of get that look. But then different elements, like I was trying to figure out, okay, this sort of paneling that you see on the sides, is that raised material or is that just painted shadow? And that kind of thing I couldn't really determine. And so I did my best guess, and I was like, I kind of wanted to do a raised material, but then I wasn't sure, and so I ended up doing a sort of a faux painting technique where you paint the shadow into the paneling to give that sort of same effect of a relief. Are the sort of primary things that stick out, but for the most part, I think it looks pretty close. But then things like on the side here, I wanted to sort of match that knot, because it looks like, I don't know if you really wanted to tie it there, or if that was sort of something that broke and then it got retied. But in some cases, I would just try to do my best guess and figure out, okay, well, at least I'll copy it here, and then if I need to do the same on the other side, I'll do that, because obviously the string is still here that would connect there. But in mine, I would make it a little bit more finished to look like, even though this is in process, how much do you add to it, and how much do you leave the way it was?
Yeah. Well, it's fun to see them side by side.
Yeah, a little narrower than I expected, but that's the thing. You only get so many dimensions, and you can only send so much information, and things like the sides here where they're missing pieces. I thought, well, I'd like to see what that looks like fully completed, and so I went ahead and added that part in, because paper just doesn't hold up over hundreds of years. or 100 years.
And there's a lot more on there, but yeah, this is a beautiful example, and of course a native horse, as you can see with the saddle on top, woman's riding saddle. But so yeah, if you can just, I know this I think was one of the pieces you wanted to highlight, and technically looks difficult with the saddle and everything, so.
Yeah, right. So there has a few elements on this one that were different from some of the other ones I've worked on. One, it had this pose that was almost like, I kind of look at it as like leaning into the wind. It's like, it looks like it's about ready to go. So I left this one for my last one to sculpt of the 3 horses I did for this project, because of its that sort of complexity. And but similarly to how I can see here, it was a clay sculpt, and so I'd started with a wire armature and would build up the clay from there, and then do the finishing touches, sort of detail work after it was sort of roughed out. And then from there, I made a mold and cast it in a pottery plaster, which has a nice balance of density. It's a very strong plaster, but it's also porous enough that you can do some carving to it afterwards. So any refining or things that didn't come out quite right in the casting, you can refine that way. And looking, at this, I did a very similar technique of once it was removed, once I removed the clay from the mold, I would build a wire armature into that mold and then cast the plaster into that. And so what that does is it just gives it more strength and rigidity. And as you can see where this one has sort of fallen away on the back leg, I can actually see the gauge of wire he used and compare that to sort of the materials I did, and note sort of how or close and similar we were. And then from there, I think the next thing I did was fitting the saddle, and that was made out of just a solid piece of poplar that I carved down, and ended up using a rabbit hide for the fur because it had a real fineness to it that matched the sort of scale I think that we were going for. And in certain places around the edges of it, I would remove the fur to sort of give it more of that worn look and sort of traveled look. The leather for it, I ended up using a deer hide. Deer hide also had that just the right amount of, it was the thinnest leather that I could come across. And so one, it was very easy to work with, and secondly, it had that sort of fineness, so it wouldn't look too bulky or too thick for the scale that we were going for. The rope that I used to sort of tie off and do some of the tack on it was all linen, which I also assumed that he would have had at the time. And then the buckles and things like that I just built out of wire, sort of matching the pieces that he had. And so test fitting that, the last part were the stirrups, and that I ended up using a same thing, built a wire sort of frame and then coated that in a sculpting wax, which was the same sort of wax I used on the Outlaw and some of the buffalo robes. And then from looking at it, I was looking at some of the research for it, and I realized that the rider that was also associated with this, in some of the historical photos, you can actually see him on the horse with the buffalo robe over his lap. And so it sort of explained why he didn't have legs. And so I built the rider at the same time as this, and so then I could use those two and sort of make sure that everything fit in the event that we wanted to sort of combine them all three. Whereas initially when I bid the project out, I didn't have any idea that they were meant to live together, but that was sort of going into the historical background to it, was pretty fun, and seeing, oh yeah, maybe you do want that. And so in that event that you wanted that to do that, then I would go from there. And then once everything was sort of sized in the right scale and shape, then I would get them ready for paint. And so I just sort of coat them with a gesso, and then from there do the base coats and build up the colors after I sort of color matched as best I could from the print and from the images on my computer. I did my best to color match, and they had sort of the fade going up on the legs and a little bit of the dirt on the hooves, which I liked in particular. And then I believe this one is the bay horse blaze face, and so I had to get the blaze on the nose there. And a little bit of detail on the saddle and a little aging on that. Sort of completed the look.
Yeah, when you had spoken before about the muscle detail of the horses in a previous conversation, if you can elaborate on that, because when I'm looking at it, I can definitely see, well, the differences too, but how skinny sort of Russell's horse is, and but even when you talked about the pose and the leaning, it's so apparent in Russell's, and it's those little aspects that you don't, when you're first looking at it, you don't notice unless you have to really look at it, obviously replicate it.
Sure. Yeah, and by comparison. So while I was building these horses, I surrounded myself, sort of immersed myself in the images you provided, as well as a whole slew of horse anatomy. And so I would get a number of all the musculature, so I could find out where the tendons connected and where the sort of caving out needed to be on the backs of the legs. Really needed to appear, but once I realized I was getting into the sculpt, I was like, oh, I need a little bit more information, and so I went online and found some horse models that I could use to, sort of hold directly next to some of these, and just to kind of get some other forms and the other shapes that I needed. And I found that using the anatomical drawings that I found and using these horse models was great in sort of getting the overall form and proportions, but Russell's horses were so much more used, and what I found myself having to do was just remove muscle after I had sculpted it already, because it just didn't have that look of, I refer to it as kind of like sculpting a rusty pickup truck, where it isn't something that rolled right off the line. It's not this idealized form. It's been used every day, and in particular you see it in some of the other ones where you get these sort of caving out on the hips, and the hips stand out, where you look at all the sort of equestrian art and everything is sort of this idealized form of horse. Russell was really going for one that was seeing daily use, and even maybe a little bit on the hungry side. And so that was something that I could only learn by really diving into it, and so yeah, it was a series of more removal once I kind of got close to it. And I was like, okay, yeah, no, it's still too fat here, or still too muscular here, and so having to take that into account was a pretty unique thing, because you don't think about sculpting something that's not its ideal form, right? But in that, it gives it more character and it gives it a little bit more life than I think your typical horse sculpture.
Yeah, that has been said a lot, that when you look at Russell's horses, not only in painting but sculpture, he's showing the Western horse, which is a lot different than the horses out east, what they call it, like an Indian pony, or bred to be a lot thinner and leaner, and it has sort of a different look and a little bit different gait. And
sure.
You can definitely see that.
Yeah. In particular, I think it was the gray horse. That was a really lean one in comparison to some of these, where I was like, this I think was the most muscular I got for this project. But even then, really hollowing out the backs of the legs, so you see the tendons coming out, really kind of gives that sense of a definition.
Russell sure loved his horses, so it was an animal I was really familiar with.
Yeah, and this was a great one too, because this was my third of the 3 horses I did for the sculpt, and I found after doing a few of them that I could just sort of start sculpting, and after a certain period of time I no longer needed to look at the research that I had around me, because it again was a good starting point, but it was starting to lead me too far astray, and so I found myself just kind of getting to understand the proportions and understand where the muscles were and understand where it needed to be a sort of thinner shape that sort of allowed me to sort of understand and get the essence of the object, where after this one in particular, all the other horses or all the other mammals I did, I think it was the sheep and the elephant, they all just became a little bit more natural to make, because I understood the the form. And if you look at a deer skeleton to a sheep skeleton to a horse skeleton, they're much more similar than they are different. And so you kind of get that idea of its basic layout, and then it could inform how I sculpted everything else after that.
Yeah, even just looking at the horse's expression and the ears back, and you can just see that he's sort of a wary horse right there. And so that's, I don't know, I guess I haven't looked as hard when they're, until you start looking, you see so much.
Yeah.
So that's really great.
Could you turn them sideways and talk about the hips and the leg again real fast?
Sure,
Just
yeah.
so the camera can see a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, so when looking at the positioning and the pose of this horse, it was a little different than the other two because it really seemed as though it was leaning, I refer to it as like leaning into the wind. It looked like it was ready to go. And so it has this sort of forward movement to it, even though it's standing still, that I just love about it. And in particular, on some of these where I was looking at some of the models that I had that had more of a idealized horse, what for these, I really needed to go back in and take away material, and take away clay, so that it really showed more of the tendons and the musculature, and even in the hips, the bones start to come out a little bit, and you won't see that on the sort of idealized sculpture of horses. In particular, you can see it on the back tendons, on the back of the legs, and on the front, sort of behind the front leg. I never got to the point where you could see ribs, which was nice, but it was that on the edge of being, like I like to say, of a little bit closer to a rusty pickup truck than something that rolled right off the line. It's a fun thing to sculpt something that's not its idealized form, or at least what we think of as idealized. This is a little bit more real and a little bit more used every day. Yeah, so I kind of was in the same deal. It's like, elephant, all right. Obviously we have a lot of American animal transportation, so it was like, he was very interested in the horses, and so I looked at it as like, well, maybe you liked non-European mammal transportation as well. That's sort of my take on it, because it has a full saddle of sorts, a blanket, and I believe this is an Asian elephant, so probably something from India or thereabouts. And so with this one, it was a very different form, but again, after doing the horses, it really helped me inform sort of where the bones were. Even though there's a lot more mass here, you still have to figure out where the knees are and where the little pads for their feet go. And so this case, this was a clay sculpt that I built up with the armature, and then once the clay was just about finished, then I carved out some of the tusks out of a poplar wood again, because of its lack of knots and ease to carve. And I thought, well, I'll put both of them in because I kind of want to see. I think it would have had that at that point when he made that. And so you can see here, this one is missing one here on this side. But looking at the structure of it and where it needs to have the balance and the wrinkles were the sort of primary goal of mine, and then shaping out the form and looking at things that, there are holes in the top, and you can kind of see it if I lean this one forward. And there were nothing in them, so I always kind of assumed maybe there were flags or some type of poles that would go into that, maybe a harness for leading it, but as the time goes by, we kind of lose some of those, and so you're just sort of left to your best guess of what it was.
Yeah, sometimes I even think, well, because a lot of these he would give as gifts for Christmas, and he put, there's one example where he did an oxen cart, he put a string of 10-cent pearls in it as, a Christmas gift to his neighbor Josephine Trigg. But he also used a lot of these pieces too. They had themed dinners, like he did turkeys for Thanksgiving. But I think too, maybe those were for candles because he did some candle holders or something like that. So it's interesting how, too, he'd sort of elevate some of his everyday activities with his art and make it fun for the people that came to his dinner or events or had special occasions. And so, yeah, it's kind of just to think about that utilitarian way Russell really used his sculpture.
Yeah, and even some of the Native American busts that I did had little holes by their ears and sort of behind it. You're like, well, maybe that was jewelry at some time, whether that's been lost or just sort of never even had in the first place. You kind of left to just wonder what it is.
Right, some of the holes on top for Christmas ornaments.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I could see that. But yeah, this was a fun one, and then actually has a sort of amusing story. As I was finishing the paint job on it, I was using a cadmium yellow for the accent color, and I only had a small amount left, and I needed to get some more. And it was this past winter when I don't know, in Minnesota where I was working, we had one of the coldest winters we had in about 30 years. And so I was like, oh, I got time. I'm right in the middle of it. I'm going to go to the art store and pick it up. And they had closed just due to cold. And I had not seen that before. And so I came back to the studio. I'm like, oh, I can wait till tomorrow or the next day or see. But the nice thing about where I worked is it's a shared studio space with about 3 or 4 other artists. And my brother is one of them. And so he's a painter. And so after I got back, I just started digging through his materials. And sure enough, found about a half bottle or half tube of cadmium yellow to finish the project up. And yeah, it's interesting to see how the aging takes effect. And when I built these, the sort of goal was to look like he had just left the room after completing them. And so you're sort of left to determine how much of the aging was intentional and how much was just part of the years passing.
Yeah, as I look at both, I'm looking at the expression in the eyes and the liveliness. And can you talk about maybe how you tried to capture it?
Yeah, so the eyes are always the most challenging part of any sculpt as far as I'm concerned. And what really is something that's not natural to think about is how far inset they really are. And so with each of my pieces, as I'm carving them, I just rough things out and sort of get the form, and then rough them out and get sort of details, and then rough them out and get the details. And I had to keep recessing the eyes back, because even in like humans, we don't realize how far back our eyes are in our head, and only about a quarter of them are visible. And so the same with the elephant. They really had to appear inset, but at the same time have this really prominent brow that comes out around each side, and also the sort of matching that with the wrinkles and the shapes that I need to sort of delineate the space was the key. You can get by with some painting. The painting does add quite a bit, but if you don't have that general sense of that they're really deep in there, then it doesn't read well, and it looks like you just sort of pasted on some googly eyes. And so with each one of them that I learned, is like, you just keep going further in and further in and further in. And luckily, one of the nice things I had going on in the project was sharing the space with other artists. Was one of my friends, an artist, Craig Fernholtz, was a gentleman who was raised on a farm, and he was a great person to have on my side to just give me another eye when I'm looking at something too long. I have tricks where I can, if I want to check the symmetry on a face, for instance, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll put the object in front of a mirror and hold the mirror up so I can see it from a reverse angle. And a lot of times you'll see the things you might have missed, or things that look balanced to you, but then you flip it around and it looks very prominent, and all those things sort of stand out then. And the one thing Craig would bring to it would be this sort of just the knowledge of these mammals and these horses. He was raised on a pig farm, and so he'd be like, no, it's got to look a little, push those back a little bit more, squish this part in, and so in that, I'd always try to get a time where him and I could get together before I got into the plaster casting, just to get some more feedback, because I can look at things for weeks and it looks great to me, but you get some fresh eyes on it and you can learn a lot about yourself from that. So that was something that was very useful in this project, and one of the benefits of having people around.
That's interesting that you say you looked at it through a mirror, because Russell did the same thing.
Oh yeah, and I actually learned that from studying Rodin in college, and saw the size of mirrors he would have in his studios, because he did these enormous bronzes as well, and so he'd have like sort of bigger than 6 feet tall mirrors in his studio, and that's where I first cued in on the technique, and it was like, yeah, I've used it ever since. When writing together all these answers to your questions, I realized like how many people I leaned on in this project. Like I have a lot of experience, a lot of different things, but this one really pushed me to a way that like I wanted to, having worked and having all these great artists at the Guthrie that I work with. It was like the wig department, the paint department, people I knew in the prop department were all people that ended up lending a hand in it, if not just kind of giving me ideas or anything else.
It's kind of fun that they were all, like you said, a part of this project, kind of looking at Russell themselves.
Oh, for sure. And bringing it to it, just their expertise and their background. The thing about the eyes, you were talking about those, how important they are, not only at the spark, but as a human, for some reason, that's what we're drawn to. That's the first thing we see. And a friend of mine said, who advised me on this project, was like, when it's right, but when it's wrong, you know it. And that's the thing. It's like you really, people don't really say much when it looks accurate, but people are not shy at all about telling you when it's not right. And so that was the trick. If you could just say back, yep, that was good. And you're usually in a pretty good place.
So, I know you were surprised to see Elves as part of the project, but I should say that Christmas was Russell's favorite holiday, and he would often shut himself in his cabin here in his studio and make Christmas presents for all his friends.
Mm-hmm.
So he would hide them away, and for Nancy as well, and give them out for Christmas, and it was such a delight for everyone. So again, it really just shows how the sculpture was more than just an artistic project for the market. They were really, some gifts and a way he uses art to show his appreciation for his friends and relatives and family. So I'll just let you take it off.
Yeah, so I was kind of the same way. I was like, elves, what? But I loved the detail, and I loved the expressions on them. They were it was a little like they were having this little conversation, and it was almost like this one throwing his head back and laughing a little bit at whatever he's saying. But this was unique, and it provided some very unique challenges, and it was one of my first. I think I maybe did the gentleman figure, and then the elves as some of my first pieces I worked on for the whole project. And basic structure, I knew I was going to need some felt, and so I actually collaborated with a friend of mine who is I work with her in props, but she also has a background in stuffed animals and doll making, and so she helped do some of the patterning for the bodies of them. And her name is Becca Malmstrom, and so I built up the wire, and I was like, well, I just gotta figure out what this nut is. And I'm like, what kind of nut is it? Because it has a lot of character. It even has like the little insets for the eyes as a sort of little perfect nose and a little bit of character. So like when you sculpt them and carve them, there's really not much you have to do. But it's finding the nut that was the best part. So I thought, well, okay, maybe a hazelnut. So I got some of those, and way too small, wrong shape, not going to work. And then I was like, well, maybe hickory. It kind of looks like a hickory nut. So I thought I saw some at an Asian market in town, and looked around. I couldn't find them at the Asian market, so I ordered some online, and they came in, and they were the right shape, but much too small, and already cracked because they wanted to eat them. And so I was like, that's not going to work. So I was like, okay. Did some more digging. I found this shag bark hickory. You can get it out west. I probably had them in the area. Ordered those. Got them in. They were the right size, wrong shape. They were all too bulbous. Didn't have that little point. And I'm just like, come on. And so I'm starting to get a little discouraged and not really sure what I'm going to do. And so I'm like, do I got to work, shift gears and start working on a different object, and kind of getting frustrated with it. And so I just kind of go one day, take my family out and go for a walk down to Minnehaha Falls, which is a park near our house, and this lovely waterfall to get a bite to eat. And on our way back, we're walking by this house, and at the front of the house is a tree and a bunch of squirrels at the bottom of the tree. And what are you guys eating? And after this sort of nut hunt that I'm on, I'm like scrutinizing every tree, every nut I see on the ground. And sure enough, it was the perfect size, the perfect nut, and the perfect size, shape, and everything. I was like, at last. And this was about 2 blocks from my house. And I've just like told my kids, I was like, go forage, boys. And so I sent my boys out. They grabbed a bunch of them, brought them back. I threw them in my pockets. I promptly went back to the house, roasted them up, and next day I was hollowing them out and making them into the heads for this. And I couldn't believe it. It was like I looked everywhere for these things, and of course they were 2 blocks from my house. That being said, we went back for a walk. Well, I went back and spoke with the owner. Turned out it was a bitter nut. Hickory was the specific nut that I believe was used in this. And then he had no problem with me collecting them and gathering them. But we went back like a couple months ago and walking back to the same park, and the tree had been cut down. It's gone. And so it had like this window of one harvest, and it just worked out great. So ended up using the same one for the gentleman, the dancing girl, and all of these figures had the same sort of nut shape. From there, it was basically just laying out sort of how much padding each character needed to sort of flesh out the shapes, finding a log that was a suitable log, and then doing this little trinket on the end, which you can kind of see here. That's this little spade shape that was on the back. And so I ended up just cutting that out of a solid piece of brass stock, which I figured would be similar to what he did. And then drilling it out so it could be a little ornamental piece, some belt buckles. And then they're all in a little arrangement of what appears to be a maple leaf below them. But knowing the nut story, it was probably hickory. I just sort of had that to sort of finish that out, and then glue them together and kind of do a few notes on the sewing, and matching the thread thickness and shape. Was a pretty good feat, but I think in the end served to be pretty convincing.
Yeah, I think the more you look at Russell, I'm sure the more you've experienced how important foraging is to his works and getting the character in the natural objects.
Yeah, and using that so well. It's like, like I was saying, it really gives a lot of life from something that you don't have to do much to when it comes to that species of nut, and just the perfect log that you just walk upon them in the woods here, hanging out. Fabric.
So this is the Outlaw character, what we termed, but it could be, someone has suggested it was an Eskimo. Or some type of maybe boxer figure or something to that effect. But.
Yeah, he certainly seems like he's in a fighting stance. And with the knife on his side, he certainly means some business. But yeah, this was a fun one. There was a piece that I did before this that was called a preliminary figure, and that was one that I built that had a it was just in process. And so for that one, I started to sort of understand what the wax medium was and what the best method of buildup were for these. And so on that project, that's sort of where I figured out what type of wax to use. And so I knew I have to do a buildup of a body, so I built a wire armature, finding the same gauge. Looks pretty close of a annealed wire, and then getting the nails right so that it's all held down with nails. And then the buildup of the body is basically all twill tape, and so you sort of wrap around the armature until you get a thick enough sort of form or a body. And then from there I patterned clothes to sort of match the same look over the twill tape. But with the first one I did, I noticed that It was a wax, and I'd done some wax carving before in my undergrad when doing a lost wax bronze casting. And in that, you used a microcrystalline wax that had, it was a brown wax, but it has a really nice property. It's kind of sticky, but at room temperature, it still remains somewhat flexible. And so I was like, well, I want to use that for this because I'm sure that was around at the turn of the century. And so once I figured out what that was, I tried to look for it. I couldn't find it any places locally, so I ordered some and got it in, and it looked perfect. It was like the right brown. It was the same material I worked with before. And then when I heat it up on a hot plate, brush it on to the twill tape or to the pattern, something happened in heating it up that changed the color of the wax and sort of made it into more of a tan instead of a brown like you see on his feet here. Oh, that's not going to work. So I tried a couple things that could maybe darken it, tint it, and those didn't work. And so then I ended up going to an art store and buying some pigment that's used in encaustic painting, and that's where you paint with wax on canvas, typically. And you can get sort of a raw pigment with a little bit of linseed oil in that. So then I added a raw umber tint to the wax once it was melted, and did a few different tests of that until the point that I could get the color match right once it cooled. And so that ended up being the same wax sort of formula for the preliminary figure, the Outlaw, the buffalo robe, and all the edges of the teepee. Ended up coming out of that same formula. So for this guy, his body's all made out of twill tape, and then he's wrapped in a linen, and then the belt that goes around him is all paper. And when I look at it here, it looks to be about the same, and it appears as though he just used these little, almost like quilting pins to hold parts of it together, almost like a belt buckle. And so I used the same type of pin for that as a sort of final way to finish off the form. And then he's got this hood that conceals a face, where the face is kind of a peculiar face as well. And if you can kind of see it closer, it looks like he's like a boxer or somebody who's got kind of beat up. He's all puffy on one side, and his nose is pushed over to the side, and like he's got a broken nose. And so I sculpted the face out of clay, and then made a mold of that and cast that in plaster to embed a wire in, so then I could tie that into the rest of the body. But it was funny because it was like basically sculpt a face and then just smush it down, because that nose really has that sort of beaten up, hard living look to it. And then from there, just sort of painting the face out before getting too far along so that that's fully done. And then he's got a little visor in there. And then once it was fully painted, then I could wrap it in its last layer of linen and just give it a little brush over seal coat with the wax once it's a melted temperature. But you had to kind of get it right at this perfect point. If it was too hot, it would just seep right into the clothes and you'd just see the fabric. And if it was too cool, it would just lay on top of the fabric. And so you had to get it right in this sort of in-between state of it would sink into the fabric but also lay on it to get that right look. So it took a little bit of R&D, but that was the beautiful thing about this project, was there was so many steps along the way that I could either figure out what worked or what didn't, and then use that to inform the next step. And so I always started with the simpler and smallest objects and worked my way up to the largest, and so the last would have been the teepee.
Yeah, it's interesting how you nailed it down to give it a sort of a little spring. I don't know if that's for shadow effect, or I don't know if you had any comment on that.
Or it's like foot's raised up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't, for the life of me, I'm trying to figure that out, and like why he left the hook on the hand, if that was just something that he was going to get to eventually, or just didn't want to have to sculpt on it. But a lot of his other ones, you don't see the way that the armature is attached to the board, or sort of see it in this sort of, it looks like it's almost in a progress state. But yeah, I don't know. I think it may have to do with the stance, but then, a lot of his figures, or some of the figures I sculpted, did have this really wide stance because they were meant to ride horses, and so he could drop them onto horses. So I don't know if that was part of it, but yeah, it's hard to say.
So did anything about this entire project surprise you?
I'm surprised by. Yeah, I think a number of things surprised me. One thing that stands out was when I started to work on it, and in the first batch, I did them in 2 batches. And after the first batch, I was building the Native American busts, and started with the smaller ones and worked my way up to the larger. And by the time I got to the larger one, I was sort of sculpting his face, and usually I would hold it with one hand and sculpt it with the other. But then I just found myself, as I was working on it, that my hands just started working together, and when you're working on sort of something like a face or anything you needed symmetry on, it's much easier to do that simultaneously than it is one side and then work on the other work. And so I found myself doing things without thinking about it, and so it was sort of subconscious, my brain sort of taking over the project, and that was something that I had never expected to happen, where I have a process that I've done, but this project has sort of taken me to a different place, and has shown me that there are ways of doing things, and then sometimes your body just sort of knows where it needs to go. And by that third, I kind of knew where the cheekbones needed to be and the face needed to be, and so I stopped really looking at the research, and I started just to feel the piece a little bit, because I haven't had a chance to spend this too much time working on just one person's art. And by the time I was sort of halfway through, then it really started to sink in. Like, I felt like I really understood what his style was, and it sort of just started to come out of me, and that's something that I never really expected.
That's great. So you would say then the most complex piece that you worked on is the teepee. Can you talk about some of just the challenges in general with that? I know it's so large and...
Yeah, right. First was the scale. It was quite large, and then just the layer of complexity that needed to go into it, and the you could tell the attention of detail that Charles Russell gave to it when he built it. And so when I approached it, I had to think about, well, first things are the poles, and so and construction methods of how one would assemble the teepee, because the more I researched it, the more I figured out, okay, what type of teepees would have been used in this part of the country, first off. Then I watched a number of videos on YouTube of people constructing teepees, because that's very important to the overall construction. You start with a tripod and then add a specific poles in specific orders, so that they all lay the right way and hold the cover on correctly. Otherwise, the door doesn't fit in the right place, and found out that the orders is super important. Not only that, but like the gaps around the edges of the teepee are important for the airflow, and so that the smoke will go up into it. And so those kind of things I started off by focusing on, and then once I got into the canvas, I had to test out 3 or 4 different types of canvas before I could find the right one that was the right texture, the right thickness, and the right color. And so once I found that, then I said, okay, well, I can use this on the buffalo robe, I can use it on the door, the teepee, and everything. It ended up being sort of my go-to canvas for everything, and it was something similar to what you could paint on, but it would be something available at the time. And then once I saw that sort of part of it, then I went online and actually found some old drawings that were sort of almost like etchings that somebody had made of patterns of teepee covers, and so then I used those to inform my patterning for the canvas. I lay that over it, pin everything in place, and then sort of do any sort of fine detail work that I need to sort of make sure it fit right. And then I'd go in and do the cutaways of the bottom gaps, because it appears as though, what I could tell is that he was going for a hide teepee, whereas most of them now are made out of canvas, but the color was close enough to match, and from what he used a canvas, but it was sort of replicating hide. And so once I figured that out and got the right wrap, I really wanted it to sort of tighten up and be a little stiffer around the frame. And so I ended up talking with some of my friends in the scenic painting department who paint backdrops for theater. and they use a lot of canvas. And I was like, what kind of thing would really bring it in? And they're like, oh, you probably want to use a sizing medium. And I'm like, well, what would be around the turn of the century that he would have used? And it would probably be a cornstarch and water mix. And so you mix up a cornstarch and water mix and sort of spray it all down or brush it down over the canvas after everything's sort of pinned into place. And that just tightened everything up right around all of the poles, as well as stiffened it. So it made it really easy to sort of take on and off. From there I could go in and lay in the wax, because all of the edges were coated in wax. And I think that was one to look sort of more like a buffalo hide, almost like a fur or something were coming out along the edges, but also it aided in removal, so I could take it on and off and not have to have the edges fray. And so I got those in. I had all the pins made and carved each pin that sort of holds the flaps together. And then there were things like the smoke flaps. I think that initially he would have had 2 poles on the back that would have held the flaps out open, and those weren't in the version, but all the versions of the teepees I had found had those, and so I added those into it. And they do a sort of cross piece across the back of the teepee, but they also pull against the structure of the frame, and with that it gives a little bit of a spring to the poles, and that sort of pulls the flaps open and keeps them open. So I figured that part out and added that in, and just kind of getting into the last bits. And I was looking at the research, and I looked, and there was like 1 or maybe 2 photos you sent that had a shot we could see through the opening and into the space within it. It was quite dark, but I could see, no, there was a painting on the inside, and there was a liner on the inside. And so I was like, oh man, I didn't see it for the first like month of working on it. I was like, all right, no, we got to go back. I got to do that. Because no matter what, if you build a little structure with a little door in it, you're going to look into it. That's just in human nature. You're going to want to see it. And so then I had to take everything apart again and pattern a liner for the inside. And it looked like a buffalo hunt was going on, sort of painted onto the inside. And then what the liner also does is it not only adds some warmth and something you can decorate for within, but it also aids in that airflow. And so it's sort of an essential part of the teepee, so I knew I'd have to do that. So I went back and added the liner, tied that off, wrapped it all, and then added the sort of deer motif that had gone around it. And I think there was a buffalo head in the middle and the back with a little striping. And all of that needed to be done. It sort of looked like a weathered painting on it, so then I had to make sure that the wash was right and that the amount of water to paint was good. And so once I figured those pieces, then I could do that. But I of course saved that to be the last thing I did, and it was one of those projects where, like, unlike the horses, unlike anything else, if I made a mistake, it's not like I could recast it. I'd have to start over from scratch. And so I wanted to have as much knowledge of this piece as possible for tackling that. And then basically after that was just a matter of adding some sort of brown washes to it to make it look like it had been used in some sort of dirt spray on the sides from being in storms and things like that. But that pretty much completed it. Oh, and then of course there was the drum and the rifle and the other things that sort of added to, I think it was maybe a drying rack that was on the side of it. I was trying to figure out what that was. I couldn't find much research for what that structure was that was sort of leaning against the teepee.
Oh, it could have been a travoy or something. I'd have to look.
Yeah, or maybe something that they used to transport the teepee.
Yeah.
It could have been a number of things, but those things I sort of worked on as sort of the last things before packing everything up and sending it off.
So what was the most memorable part of this project? Was it the beech nut extravaganza, or was there something else I'm sorry, Hickory Nut.
Hickory Nut, yeah. Well, the Hickory Nut Saga was definitely a memorable one. But yeah, I think it was, it's just really that experience I had of working on that, the bay horse blaze face that had that leaning forward look, and how, like, similar to the Native American, how I could, by the third time at it, it just sort of would happen on its own. And I was going through all the steps and all the processes, but because I've done it enough, it started to get into my muscle memory, and I sort of knew where the muscles were, and I knew where the tendons would go, and in that way I sort of became one a little bit with the object. And going forward after that, I just had this confidence and a comfort and ease with the other animals moving forward, that it was just a great experience.
And did this project change in any way the way you approach your art, or anything like that?
Well, it certainly informed a lot of what I do, and vastly increased my knowledge of like animal anatomy and how I would go about a process like this. But also, just the wide range of materials I use is going to inform my sort of life moving forwards, because I had to touch on so many materials that I've never worked with, including making human hair miniature wigs. Those things like, I'm not sure when I'm going to use it again, but there's just such a breadth of work that needed to be done, and so many different materials to touch on, that I can't let it help but affect how I approach projects going forward.
Did it give you any more appreciation for Russell and his sculpting ability and his wide array of medias, would you say?
Oh yeah, definitely. And like I was saying, just for me to accomplish this, it wasn't possible. I had to rely on so many different friends and artists that I work with for their insights, and in some cases to work on it directly. It was a project that I couldn't have done on my own. And so having the opportunity to have other people help lend advice, give me advice on wig manufacturing and what type of stitching to use, were things that if I were to do it solely on my own would be years to do, whereas this was done more in months.
Would you say, are you drawn from this project, being able to create these replicas that then inform people who come to see the studio to get a sense of Russell's artwork? They're sort of reliving history in a way through your art.
Yeah.
Would you say that's important to you, or is it, I don't know if you want to talk about that idea, maybe more hoping that historical connection to the artwork?
Well, and I think it does, and it is something that I am drawn to, especially with my work in theater that I've been doing for a number of years. Something that I didn't know much about at first, but really got drawn to, was like the dramaturgy, where you need to build something that fits that time and that place to help tell that story. And if you do it right, making something that just blends and fits into a time period, whether it's how you make it and what materials you make, and in the end result it's something that could only have existed at that time, that takes the viewer and the people that are watching it sort of to a different place, and they sort of forget where they are. And that's, I think, really a sign that you've done it right, when people sort of forget what time they're in and what it is they're watching, or where they're watching it from. That's something that really excites me, and I think this project provided that and allowed me to sort of dive into a time period that I knew some of, but really got to explore in depth.
So now that we're sitting in Russell's log studio cabin, are you feeling the magic? And would you say you like the presentation now, seeing all these artworks together?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like it's strange. I've spent so much time researching this space that I feel like I know it and I've sort of been here before. But being in it, yeah, it's humbling. It's really great to see how well preserved it is, and especially to see the context of which he made everything in. I think it's eye-opening, and I think everyone should get a chance to see it, because this is where it was all made.